Welcome to another Monday Morning Pastor, where we look at some of the teaching we had in church yesterday and apply it to our daily lives. And yesterday we had communion together, receiving what some people call the Eucharist or the Lord's table. And the subject of worthiness came up. In other words, who is worthy to receive communion? And three different situations occurred yesterday, either during the sermon or after the sermon, that led to the question, who is worthy of coming to the table and receiving the elements? The first story regarded one of our leaders who shared an experience when he grew up in church many years ago, that in that particular church, the only people allowed to take communion were the leaders, were the pastors and the elders, not the congregation. Now, I had never heard of anything like that, and if you have, I'd love to hear your experience, but the regular folks were not allowed to receive communion, just the leaders. The second situation was regarding our church. Many years ago, I grew up in my religious life, which really took place mostly in college, when I got really serious about the Lord, was that we would receive communion in different ways. Sometimes we would receive it passively, seated in our chairs or in the pew, the plate would be passed by, and we would receive the bread and the cup. At other times, we went forward in a meeting. There'd be a common table up front or maybe several stations, and you'd go forward for communion. And both ways were meaningful to me because I think both methods emphasize different aspects of communion. The first method, receiving, it's like a demonstration of God's grace. It's a gift to us and we simply receive it. The other method is an emphasis on decision. We have to decide to get out of our chair and come forward to the Lord. And so I think it emphasizes both theological truths about God. It's the fact that He gives us His grace, He gives us faith, He gives us salvation, but on the other side, we make a decision toward it. So we were serving communion, maybe for the first time in this method where we had people come forward. Again, this is over 30 years ago. I'll never forget, this nice lady comes forward afterwards, but she was upset. She was upset at the method of communion of having to get out of her chair and come forward. I go, why is that difficult for you? And she said, I feel like I'm showing off. I feel like I'm bragging by getting out of my chair and coming forward. And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, in a sense, we are showing off, but what we're showing off is our guilt, our sin, and our need for God. We're not showing off that we're better or worthy, just the opposite. Coming forward is an act of need and desiring God more in our lives. The last story was an interesting one, an experience I had right after church. One of our members shared that when he grew up, children who had not been baptized or who were members were not allowed to have communion. You had to have been baptized, you had to be a member before you were allowed to have communion. Now, in our church, children are welcome to be served. They typically go to a children's church message in another room. There, the teachers prepare them, remind them what communion is, and then they come back to church, big church, and have communion with us. And many of those young children have not yet made the decision to be baptized. Is that okay to do that? Well, I think so. I'm reminded of the passage in Scripture in Matthew chapter 19, when the disciples were forbidding children to come up to Jesus. Jesus had large crowds around him, and these disciples thought it's the adults that were important. The adults were the worthy ones. And so they were kind of shooing away the children. But Jesus, noticing that, says to them, let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. And he received them and he blessed them by putting his hands on their heads and their shoulders and letting the kids know they were welcome. So were any of these people worthy? That seems to be the primary question. None of us are worthy of God's grace. And when we receive, whether it's weekly or monthly, when we receive the bread representing the broken body of Jesus Christ, and we receive the cup representing his shed blood, his death for us, it is always a profound acknowledgement that we are not worthy. We will never be worthy. And we take it really confessing to the Lord that we need more of Him. So who should take communion? Those of us that are unworthy, which I think would be all of us. So thank you for watching and listening today, and I hope this was helpful to you.